Have you ever built something so reliable, so perfectly tuned to its environment, that no one noticed it existed until the day it was taken away? My name is Rourke. For over a decade, I served as a systems engineer in the United States Army. Not in some glass office designing theoretical tech for future wars, but on the ground, forward operating bases, blackout tents, crisis zones where nothing worked except what absolutely had to. When I left active duty, I took that mindset with me into civilian defense contracting. I built a logistics and mission planning platform that never failed. Not once. Not during live operations in Eastern Europe, not during black flag readiness drills, not even when entire base networks collapsed from cyber attacks. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't cloud native, it didn't have predictive AI overlays or blockchain integrations, but it worked. Quietly. Reliably. Every time. Then the new civilian director arrived. He had never served, but he brought polished slides and venture, capital promises. Overnight, everything changed. My system was labeled obsolete, decommissioned, replaced. I didn't argue. In the military, you learn to follow orders even when they're wrong. But 3 weeks later, they called me. And by then, the damage was already done. He arrived in a tailored suit with a defense contractor badge clipped just a little too visibly to his chest. His name was Elliot Granger, newly appointed Director of Strategic Technologies at Fort Doyle, a domestic base with NATO interface capabilities. His resume was stacked with Silicon Valley startups, innovation labs, and speaking engagements at tech conferences with words like disruption, synergy, and machine learning edge case, deployment. What he didn't have was 1 day in uniform. When he first visited my office, he didn't sit, just stood in the doorway glancing at my whiteboard where I was mapping redundancy protocols for a rapid response supply chain scenario. Sergeant Rourke, he said, pausing to add just the right amount of condescension to my title. Your system has served its purpose, but we're moving forward. I nodded slowly, offering no resistance. Forward to what exactly? He brightened, flipping his tablet screen toward me like a magician revealing the trick. OPERIs, AI-driven mission coordination, full-spectrum cloud infrastructure, predictive allocation through neural demand modeling. It's the future. I had read the white papers. I had also read the footnotes, where legal disclaimers buried beneath the jargon warned that OPERIs had never been tested in real-time deployment conditions. Still, I listened. That's what you do when you're the last man standing from the old regime. Our system has been field-proven under combat logistics, I reminded him calmly. OPERIs has only run simulation trials. That's where you're wrong, he said with that polished MBA-trained smile. It was tested in a simulated joint command environment in Brussels just last year. Simulated, of course. He handed me a deactivation schedule like a man delivering flowers to a funeral. My system would be phased out in 90 days. OPERIs would take full control of operational command and logistics integration. No hybrid run, no parallel trial, no contingency plan. What's the plan for transition? I asked. There won't be one. OPERIs handles everything. We've contracted. They're deployment engineers. They'll start next week. It wasn't personal. That's what he said, though he never made eye contact when he said it. After he left, I saved my last few logs and closed the system interface I'd written line by line over 6 years. There were still 10 open military contracts actively running. On it, 3 of which were mission critical. No one had asked me what the impact would be. No one had even reviewed the backup retention strategy. That night, I sent a secure archive of my system's full operational history to a private server I controlled. It wasn't a rebellious act. It was what we used to call in the field, basic insurance. Not for me. For the people who would eventually need it. I didn't storm out. Didn't throw a fit. I simply turned in my clearance badge, debriefed the OPERIs team politely, and went home. My name faded from the base's internal communications directory within a week. But something else happened that wasn't in Elliot's implementation plan. 3 weeks after my departure, the Department of Defense launched its largest NATO-integrated training operation in over a decade. Multi-branch, multi-nation, real-time logistics and simulated battlefield scenarios. Fort Doyle was the domestic nerve center. It would be Operis's big debut. And on the second day of that operation, a call came into my personal number. I was at home in my garage reorganizing old rucksacks when it rang. "Rourke," said the voice on the other end. "It's Major Keller from Doyle. We've got a problem." I knew the tone before I heard the words. "Operis is down," he said. "We've lost mission sync across 3 commands. Field units are flying blind, and we can't access backup. Logistics reports. They said you might be able to help." I looked at the phone for a moment. The same hands that had signed my dismissal memo now wanted me back, this time as a contractor. "Major," I said, "I'm available." But my rates changed, and that's when the real story started. I didn't build the system at Fort Doyle. Not originally. It started far from the polished corridors of domestic command, on a sun-bleached outpost in western Iraq 15 years ago. Back then I was Staff Sergeant Rourke, field communications lead for a logistics battalion embedded with infantry. The terrain was harsh, the missions unpredictable, and the gear unreliable. Convoys were frequently delayed, medevacs misrouted, supplies misallocated. The systems we had were never designed for combat realities. Most were off-the-shelf inventory trackers or bulky software suites written by someone who had never worn a uniform or seen the inside of a tactical operations center. One afternoon, I watched a unit lose a man because a digital supply request hadn't been transmitted through a broken satellite link. The paperwork existed. The medicine was in a crate 30 miles away, but no one knew it. That night, I opened my personal laptop, pulled an old hard drive from a busted comms unit, and started writing code. I wasn't trying to build something revolutionary. I just needed a tool that could function offline, cache requests, and sync across low-bandwidth radios. It was bare bones. Text-only interface. No icons, no animations. But it worked. At first, it handled requests. Ammo, fuel, medical. Then I added convoy scheduling, evac routing. Eventually, it tied into drone telemetry for overwatch planning. We didn't call it anything official, just Rourke's box. When Battalion HQ noticed that our unit had improved response times by nearly 30%, they asked for a demo. I cleaned up the interface, documented it, and gave them a copy. A month later, I got called to brief a 3-star general at Al Udeid. He asked how many people were on my development team. I said, "Just me, sir, nights and weekends." He asked how much funding I'd had. "None, just field necessity." He didn't say much after that, but I got orders cut the next week, transferring me to CENTCOM's Theater Innovation Task Force. They dressed it up with a lot of titles. Combat, Systems Resilience Program, and Operator-Centric Workflow Modeling. But the mission was simple: keep building the box. Over the next 5 years, I re-architected the system using hardened military-grade protocols, added real-time asset tracking, and designed modules to survive comms blackouts. It wasn't fancy, but it did what the contractors never could. When I eventually left active duty and joined Fort Doyle as a civilian, I brought the system with me, refactored for domestic network environments, adapted for interagency compliance, and rewritten to meet every bureaucratic guideline that mattered. I renamed it Sentinel. The version deployed at Fort Doyle was the result of over a decade of iteration. It had been tested on everything from humanitarian missions in the Pacific to cold-weather NATO drills in northern Norway. It could scale, adapt, and sync in environments where commercial systems failed. But what really mattered, what set it apart, was how it understood the people who used it. I'd spent years embedded with medics, engineers, and drone operators. I studied how they moved, what they reached for first in a crisis, how they worked under fatigue. Sentinel wasn't just built for workflow, it was built for war. Its alerts were tuned to mental fatigue thresholds. Its default screens were designed for quick read comprehension. Its redundancy systems were based on the reality that backup power was often unreliable, and network lag was measured in minutes, not milliseconds, and it had never failed. Not once. Not in 11 years. I didn't advertise that. I didn't need to. The soldiers knew. The commanders knew. When they needed performance, they came to Sentinel. The first time it handled a full-spectrum live fire exercise with 10 agencies involved and no data loss, word spread. Not through marketing decks or flashy demos, but through email threads between sergeants and captains. I started getting requests from other bases, some official, some off the record. But the tipping point came during Operation Winter Coil, a Black Ice Arctic logistics exercise that nearly fell apart when satellite bandwidth froze under solar interference. Every commercial platform buckled. Sentinel kept working. That was the winter Fort Doyle standardized it across all departments. By then, I had stopped thinking of it as mine. It belonged to the mission, which is what made its replacement so painful. Not because I was angry, but because I knew what would happen. Not immediately, but inevitably. The people pushing the new system never asked how Sentinel worked. They only asked if it had APIs, buzzword compliance, and market parallels. They wanted a story they could sell, not a tool that could save lives. So, I stepped aside. Silently. But I kept a copy. Not to prove a point. To protect people who didn't know they'd soon be at risk. The real shift didn't happen all at once. It crept in quietly, the way fog rolls over a ridgeline. Gradual, almost imperceptible, until you can no longer see what was right in front of you. After Fort Doyle brought in Elliot Granger as Director of Strategic Technologies, the language in the hallways began to change. Meetings that used to focus on uptime, field readiness, and cross-branch functionality were now filled with phrases like cloud modernization roadmap and stakeholder visibility matrices. At first, I thought it was just noise. Every few years, the Pentagon brings in a fresh wave of civilians who've read too many TED Talk transcripts and think operational readiness is something you can run through agile sprints. Usually they burn out after a year, but Granger wasn't burning out. He was consolidating. One of the first things he did was introduce a new procurement protocol that centralized all technology decisions under his office. What used to be a fast-moving collaboration between operators and developers turned into a bureaucratic funnel that killed momentum. He cut off direct access between engineers like me and unit commanders. If a battalion needed a change in Sentinel's reporting structure, they now had to file a formal request through IT strategy governance. 3-week response time, if they were lucky. I kept quiet. That's something you learn in the Army. When the mission shifts, you adapt. You don't whine, you observe. I watched as new consultants began showing up, men in polished shoes and pressed button-downs holding tablets instead of toolkits. Most had never set foot outside CONUS. One introduced himself as a workflow anthropology specialist. I asked him what that meant. He smiled like I was the one who didn't understand the world anymore. Then the audit started. Granger brought in a third-party tech consulting firm based out of Boston to assess our systems for modernization alignment. No one asked for the audit, and no one understood what it was actually measuring. But for 3 weeks, they sat in rooms interviewing staff, diagramming our network, and reviewing documentation I'd personally written over a decade. They never once used Sentinel in a live environment. Never asked to see it during an actual drill. Never spoke with a logistics officer or a med tech. But when the report came back, it was conclusive. Our systems were outdated, non-scalable, and lacking strategic synergy with long-term digital transformation goals. Whatever that meant, the decision came 2 days later. Sentinel would be retired. Operaries, the shiny AI cloud platform with zero field experience, would take its place. I wasn't surprised. What did surprise me was the way it happened. Overnight, my access to internal systems was revoked. I could no longer view error reports, logs, or even routine user feedback. My role was redefined, from systems architect to legacy solutions transition liaison, which meant I sat in meetings and nodded while people who'd never deployed a system in their life explained how they were going to revolutionize the mission. I tried once, just once, to raise a concern. It was during a readiness meeting, where the operations team claimed full redundancy had been successfully configured across all active units. I pointed out that some of our communications vans still used older satellite links incompatible with their encryption modules. The room went silent. Granger smiled and said, "Thank you for that historical context, Sergeant. We'll take it, under advisement." After that, I was excluded from the next 4 meetings. You don't fight in those moments. Not if you're smart. You record, you listen, you prepare. I had spent a career building something that worked under fire, and now I was watching it get dismantled by people who thought checklists were more important than contingencies. But I knew something they didn't. I knew that systems don't fail on paper, they fail in the field. And when that happened, someone would need to be ready. Not to say I told you so, to keep things from breaking further. It happened faster than even I expected. Operation Iron Cloud was the largest multi-branch readiness drill Fort Doyle had seen in over a decade. 3 days of live-fire simulations, NATO-integrated coordination, and simultaneous logistics routing across 6 different states. It was exactly the kind of test that Sentinel had passed so many times it had become routine. Only this time, Sentinel wasn't running, Opries was. The launch day came with speeches and press coverage. Granger stood beside a visiting senator talking about how Fort Doyle was now leading the charge into AI-coordinated combat support systems. I watched the live stream from my living room, coffee in hand. They even mentioned the speed at which the transition had occurred, how legacy systems had gracefully stepped aside for cutting-edge technology. By the second day, the comms started to unravel. It began with delayed convoy resupplies in the southern quadrant. Nothing major, at first, but then the delays became failures. Evac requests weren't routing. Medical drones launched without confirmed waypoints. Satellite overlays were returning blank. Units started radioing in that they were flying blind. And worst of all, no one could tell where the data had gone. Opries wasn't just glitching, it was failing silently. When Sentinel encountered an error, it logged it, flagged it, and sent redundancy protocols into motion. But Opries, in its AI wisdom, made real-time decisions based on patterns. When those patterns broke, it didn't know how to fall back. It simply stopped processing. By 1300 hours, mission sync was compromised across 3 commands. Fort Doyle's command center shut down all outward-facing interfaces and tried to re-establish order manually. There were no backups to restore from. The system wasn't designed that way. That's when the call came. I was in my garage, adjusting the torque on a half-assembled dirt bike engine, trying to enjoy the first quiet Saturday I'd had in weeks. My phone rang, and for some reason, I knew the number before I even looked. "Rourke," said the voice on the other end. "It's Major Keller, from Doyle. We hadn't spoken since the day I turned in my credentials." "I'm listening," I said. "We've got a situation. Opries is down, completely. Field units are operating with partial data or none at all. We've lost real-time visibility and backup protocols are non-existent." I waited. He continued, quieter now. "We need Sentinel. We need you." There was no apology, no retraction, just the unmistakable tone of someone in damage control mode, someone trying to hold things together while the system unraveled in their hands. "What kind of access are we talking?" I asked. "Command level. We've restored your credentials. If you're willing, we need you on base today." My laptop was already booting before the call ended. The private copy of Sentinel I'd archived was intact, version controlled, and up to date as of the day I was pushed out. I kept it maintained, not out of spite, but because I knew this day was inevitable. They thought they were buying innovation, but what they paid for was a brand name. What they threw away was institutional knowledge. As I drove toward the base, the roads were eerily quiet. Inside the gates, everything was tense, motionless, the way it gets when a machine stops working and no one knows who's really in charge. I parked and walked through the entrance. No fanfare, no briefing, just a hard drive in one hand and a base full of people about to learn a very expensive lesson about the difference between a system that sounds good and one that actually works. It wasn't revenge, it was continuity, and I was the only one who knew how to provide it. They had cleared out a side conference room in Building C, not the main command center, Too many outside observers were still milling around, pretending the lights were dimmed on purpose. A young specialist met me at the door, eyes wide and uncertain, and led me to a workstation that had been hastily reassembled with an old backup terminal. Someone had had the foresight to preserve a standalone version of Sentinel on an isolated drive, likely against protocol but definitely with common sense. Systems cold but intact, the specialist mumbled. No one's touched it since you left. Good. I plugged in the master key and watched the system wake up with the calm certainty of a tool that had no idea it had been fired. The login was clean. The dashboard populated instantly. Logistics, maps, resupply chains, active dispatch queues, every channel Sentinel used to coordinate real-time data flow. Everything was there, just waiting for someone who knew what to do with it. I ran diagnostics. No data loss. No corruption. The last backup had synced the day before I was pushed out. Within 15 minutes, I had a mirror interface running with live coordination ready to be piped into the ops room. Major Keller, I said into the field phone. You've got full visibility on Grid South. All 5 supply convoys are already en route. Medevac Flight Charlie is rerouted to Forward Post Echo. All synced and redundant. There was a pause on the line. You did that just now? He asked. I did that in 2012, I replied. Today I just turned it back on. What followed was a slow, almost reluctant shift in the building's energy. Orders flowed again. Units in the field confirmed reception. Tactical displays blinked back to life. It was as if a tourniquet had been removed and the lifeblood of the base was moving again. But something didn't sit right with me. Granger was nowhere to be seen. Word was he had taken a step back to let the implementation team regroup. I asked one of the techs where Oprah's cloud nodes had gone. The response was mumbled, something about a synchronization fault with the DoD's secure integration layer. The logs apparently had been temporarily inaccessible. Convenient. I requested access to the system status reports filed by the Opry's vendor. It took a little pushing, a few bypassed authorization requests, but I eventually got what I needed. And what I found was worse than failure. It was concealment. The vendor, Tri-Grid Solutions, had quietly disabled Sentinel's fallback routines during deployment, flagged them as legacy risk redundancy modules. That wasn't just negligence. That was intentional obstruction. Sentinel had been designed to operate alongside other systems to remain dormant if needed, but ready if required. But Tri-Grid didn't want the old system showing up the new one. They buried it. The real kicker? Their core infrastructure wasn't even compliant with real-time command routing under Joint Ops protocols. Half their features worked on commercial cloud standards. The other half had been simulated in controlled environments but never tested under field latency. I traced the decision chain and found something else. Granger had authorized the full cutover 3 weeks ahead of schedule to align with the visit from a Senate Oversight Committee. He'd sacrificed stability for optics. That was more than a bad call. That was strategic recklessness. By late afternoon, Fort Doyle was operating at 90% restored functionality, 100% if you asked the commanders in the field. Sentinel had re-established contact with 17 active units, processed 68 live logistics events, and resynced 8 disconnected comms nodes across 2 regional relay stations. It was doing what it was always designed to do, work without applause. Major Keller came to the conference room just before sundown. He looked tired but focused. "We owe you," he said simply. "This could have gone sideways. Fast." "It still might," I replied, tapping the audit logs I'd been collecting. Granger and Tri-Grid didn't just make a mistake. They made a cover-up. I handed him a printed report. System flags, code comments, deployment errors. All of it documented. It wasn't enough for headlines, but it was enough for consequences. "Are you willing to testify?" Keller asked. "If it comes to that," I said. He gave a tight nod, then paused. "They told us you were outdated, that your system couldn't scale, that it was patched together." "They were right," I said. "It was patched together, on sand, under gunfire, with no budget, and no help. And it worked anyway." He didn't say anything after that. He just nodded once and left. I stayed in the room a while longer, updating logs, locking the recovery protocols into place, and exporting incident files to a secured drive. Before I left, I wiped my fingerprints from the keyboard, powered the terminal down, and closed the lid. Sentinel would stay online for now. But the real battle was just beginning, because restoring the system was only half the job. The other half was making sure no one ever forgot why it had been needed in the first place. In the days that followed, the surface tension of the crisis settled, but under it, deeper fractures began to show. Sentinel had stabilized operations, and the official narrative shifted to framing the disruption as a temporary systems adjustment. No mention of Opries, no mention of Trigrid's architecture collapse, no mention of me. That was fine, for now. Because I wasn't finished, I spent the next 3 days combing through the internal deployment logs I'd recovered during the restoration. Granger's authorization forms, system integration emails, security certificates. Most of it was the usual bureaucratic fluff. But buried in a misfiled procurement appendix, I found something odd. A vendor contract agreement between Trigrid Solutions and a consulting firm named Vantage North. That name wasn't on any of the public-facing documentation. It took some digging, but eventually I traced Vantage North's ownership filings. It was a shell firm, registered in Delaware like most of them, but one of the senior advisors listed had a familiar name. Elliot Granger, former partner, no longer active according to the paperwork. But it was enough to make the air in my lungs go cold. Granger hadn't just chosen Trigrid because of flashy promises or executive-level networking. He had a financial tie, a legacy interest that was never disclosed during the procurement process. He didn't just fail upward, he monetized the failure. Opries wasn't a mistake, it was a move. Worse, I found evidence that he had bypassed standard DoD software accreditation timelines. The integration log showed skipped compliance flags and artificial pass rates generated by internal testing scripts written by Trigrid engineers themselves. It was a controlled narrative, designed to impress oversight while hiding instability beneath a layer of curated metrics, and it might have worked if Sentinel hadn't exposed the gap. I compiled everything into a classified summary file, encrypted it, and sent it to Major Keller with a single sentence. This goes higher than technical failure. Within hours, I was contacted by a representative from Army Inspector General's office. He didn't call from a baseline. It was an off-grid call. He asked for verification, then requested a face-to-face meeting. I agreed. At that meeting, I laid it all out. The procurement fraud, the artificial certifications, the shell connection to Vantage North. I also made one thing clear. I wasn't doing this for revenge. I wasn't interested in lawsuits or reinstatement. I just wanted to make sure this didn't happen again, because next time, it might not be a drill that fails. It might be a live operation. Real people. Real stakes. He listened, took notes, asked sharp questions. Then he said something that surprised me. You'd be shocked how often this happens, but you'd be even more shocked how rarely someone like you still cares enough to expose it. I didn't answer. I just handed him the drive and walked out of the room, because the system had failed. But this time, someone was going to be held accountable. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in a government-issued chair beneath the glaring lights of a Senate Armed Services Subcommittee room in Washington, D.C. The seal behind me felt heavier than it looked. I wasn't wearing a uniform, no ribbons, no nameplate, just a clean suit and a plain expression, because this wasn't about image, it was about truth. A junior senator from Illinois began the session by reading a statement on the importance of modernization in defense procurement, then turned the microphone over to me. Mr. Rourke, she said, you're here today to speak to the events at Fort Doyle during Operation Iron Cloud. Please proceed. I didn't look at the cameras. I looked at the table, then the committee, and then I spoke. I told them exactly what happened, calmly, without embellishment. I explained how Sentinel was built, how it had functioned without fail for over a decade in the most hostile environments on Earth. I laid out how it had been replaced by a system never field-tested under live conditions, authorized by an official, with undisclosed financial ties to the vendor, and how that system collapsed at the worst possible moment, during a joint force readiness drill designed to simulate battlefield reality. I handed over the logs. The emails, the altered compliance test results, the shell company records. I made it clear, this wasn't a failure of software, it was a failure of leadership, of ethics, of oversight. I expected pushback, skepticism, but what I got was silence. Real silence. The kind that happens when even the people who thought they knew what was going on realized they didn't. A retired general on the panel leaned forward, clasped his hands, and asked me the question I'd been expecting. If your system worked so well, Mr. Rourke, why was it replaced? I paused. Because it didn't sell well in PowerPoint, I said. Because it didn't use buzzwords or promise predictive intelligence. Because it wasn't sexy. It just worked. And working quietly, in a culture obsessed with optics, isn't always rewarded. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. In the weeks that followed, things moved fast. The Pentagon opened an internal inquiry. Granger was suspended pending investigation. Tri-Grid Solutions' contract was frozen indefinitely. Vantage North vanished from the registry within 48 hours, but the paper trail didn't. More importantly, a classified directive went out to all major bases. Any future technology replacements would require field-proven validation under operational conditions, not simulations, not vendor claims, and Sentinel. Sentinel was quietly reinstated as the interim standard for operational logistics coordination across 3 branches. I didn't go back to Fort Doyle. I didn't need to. The work was already done, not the code, not the patching, the principle. Someone, in that room, somewhere in that chain, finally understood. There's a difference between innovation and distraction, between leadership and ambition, between technology that looks good and technology that saves lives. Justice had never been my goal, but that day in front of the committee, it felt a lot like it. 6 months later, I found myself standing in a modest office at a federal training facility just outside Colorado Springs. The sign on the door read, Defense Operational Systems Integrity Group. Inside there were no banners, no slogans, no unnecessary buzz. Just a dozen engineers, most of them veterans, sitting at open workstations reviewing field systems submitted for pre-deployment evaluation. The Pentagon had created the task force quietly, off the radar of public relations, and they asked me to lead it. My role wasn't ceremonial. It was operational. Our job was to test every piece of logistics, communications, and mission coordination software before it got near a unit in the field. Not in a demo, not in a simulation. In sand, wind, snow, low light, high interference. Real world. Friction. The kind that fancy consultants don't factor into their ROI models. They gave me full authority to vet or reject. No appeals. No lobbying. I brought back some of the people I'd worked with during the early days of Sentinel. Developers who understood that a working interface in a clean room means nothing if it fails under stress. And I started a mentorship pipeline for recently discharged veterans. Young, sharp, technically minded soldiers who had field experience but no place to channel it. They didn't need to learn discipline. They needed someone to show them how their knowledge translated into building systems that saved time, resources, and sometimes lives. Meanwhile, Sentinel itself had evolved. Fort Doyle kept it as the core platform, but now it was being adapted for disaster relief logistics in civilian contexts, hurricane zones, wildfire coordination, even cross-border refugee resupply chains. The Department of Homeland Security had quietly requested a demo. So had NATO. I didn't license it. I didn't sell it. I shared it, under conditions that protected its integrity. I didn't want another tri-grid situation. This wasn't about capital. It was about continuity. Every few weeks I still get calls from commanders, sergeants, and occasionally civilian staff who used to think of me as the guy in the back room with the old system. They all say the same thing now. Glad you didn't. Walk away. Neither did the mission. Because some tools aren't meant to scale through marketing. They're meant to endure. built by people who've seen what failure costs and decided never to let it happen again. Not everything that shines is solid. In the world of defense, tech, and leadership, some solutions look brilliant in meetings but crumble the moment they're tested by reality. What happened at Fort Doyle wasn't just about software. It was about the cost of forgetting who we build for. Systems don't exist to impress. They exist to serve. And sometimes the only thing standing between mission failure and mission success isn't innovation, it's experience. We talk a lot about progress, but real progress doesn't mean discarding what works for the sake of what's new. It means building on what endures. The truth is, some of the most reliable systems are invisible until they're gone. And the people behind them? Often quiet, often overlooked but never replaceable. So here's a question I'll leave you with. In your line of work, what's something reliable that's being ignored until the day it fails? Let me know in the comments, I read them. And if stories like this resonate with you, real-world justice, quiet revenge, and earned redemption, consider subscribing. We've got more coming. Stories that aren't just dramatic, they're real. Until next time, remember, flashy might fail, but built to last always speaks for itself.